A young black boy was cleaning car windows at traffic lights to buy medicine for his sick mother. When he cleaned the windshield of a millionaire, everything began to change. Marcus woke up before dawn. His breath hung in the air, visible in the cold, dim room. The old heater hadn't worked in weeks, and the Chicago winter crept through the cracks in the walls. He pushed the blankets off, shivering as his feet hit the cold floor. Quietly, he tiptoed through the small apartment, careful not to wake his mother. Sarah was asleep on the worn-out couch in the living room. Marcus paused for a moment, watching her chest rise and fall with each labored breath. Her face looked pale, her cheeks sunken, her body weaker by the day. He stepped into the kitchen and filled a glass of water. The medication was already lined up on the counter, 4 different bottles, each with complicated instructions he had learned by heart. "Morning, Mom," Marcus said quietly as Sarah began to stir. She opened her eyes and gave a weak smile. "Morning, sweetheart." He handed her the water and pills, watching her struggle to sit up. She took them, swallowing with effort. Marcus forced a smile. "I'll make you some tea." "Don't bother, Marcus. You need to get ready for school," she replied, her voice barely audible. "It's no bother," he said, turning away before she could argue more. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The kitchen was a mess. Stacks of unpaid bills, old newspapers, and the ever-present worry about money weighing on him. He boiled water, made tea, and brought it to Sarah. "Thank you, baby," she whispered, her eyes showing gratitude beyond words. Marcus nodded and looked at the clock. He grabbed his school bag, gave his mother a kiss on the forehead, and hurried out. The streets were still quiet, the city waking slowly. Marcus pulled his thin coat tighter, his breath a mist in the chilly air. He had one thing on his mind: get through school and make it downtown to the intersection. He needed to make enough today. The pharmacy wasn't going to let the debt slide any longer. At school, he struggled to focus. His teachers spoke, but Marcus's mind was miles away. All he could think about was his mom, alone, needing medicine they couldn't afford. During lunch, he sat by himself, eyes fixed on the clock. When the final bell rang, he bolted out, heading straight for the bus that would take him downtown. The intersection was already crowded. Kids like him, men and women holding signs, people selling small things, each of them just trying to survive another day. Marcus found his spot near the stoplight. He watched as the cars slowed, waiting for his chance to step up and offer a windshield cleaning. A minivan pulled up. The driver waved him away before Marcus could even ask. He stepped back, not wanting trouble. The next car, a rusted pickup, had a driver that didn't even look at him, eyes glued to the light. Marcus waited, wiping his hands on the rag he carried. His stomach tightened. He hadn't eaten since morning, but it wasn't hunger that made him uneasy. It was the pressure, the meds, his mom. He couldn't go home empty-handed. Then he saw it. A sleek black Bentley rolled up to the red light. Marcus hesitated for a second. The car was pristine, not a speck of dust on it. He knew the type of driver that car would have. They didn't need him, didn't want him. But he also knew that sometimes they gave. Rich people sometimes handed out money just to get rid of you. Marcus stepped toward the car, holding up his rag, signaling to the driver. The window rolled down halfway, and Marcus saw the man inside, middle-aged, dressed in a suit, with a stern face. Marcus swallowed. "No," the man said firmly, shaking his head. "Please, sir, just $1 or $2, Marcus said, his voice low, almost drowned by the street noise. "I need to buy medicine for my mom." The man looked at him, eyes narrowing. There was a long pause. Marcus felt his cheeks flush, the cold air suddenly sharper against his skin. He thought the man would just roll up the window and drive off. Instead, the man spoke. "What's your name?" "Marcus," he said, taken aback. The man stared at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a wallet. Marcus's heart pounded. Maybe he'd get enough to pay off the pharmacy debt today. The man took out a bill, folded it, and handed it to Marcus. Marcus took it with trembling hands, glancing down. $20. It wasn't enough for everything, but it was a start. "Thank you, sir," Marcus said, but the man had already rolled up the window. The light turned green, and the Bentley moved on. Marcus stepped back onto the sidewalk, watching the car disappear down the street. He stuffed the money into his pocket, gripping the rag tightly. He wasn't sure why, but something about the man's face stuck with him. Maybe it was the way he looked at Marcus, like he saw something more than just a kid begging at a stoplight. The rest of the afternoon was tough. Most people ignored him. A few cursed at him. He managed to clean a couple of windows, but tips were sparse. By the time the sun began to set, Marcus had barely made enough to cover half of what he needed. He walked back to the pharmacy, feeling the cold settle deeper into his bones. He pushed open the door, the warmth of the store hitting him like a wave. The pharmacist, a tired-looking man with grey hair, glanced up as Marcus approached the counter. "You got it, kid?" the pharmacist asked, not unkindly. Marcus pulled out the crumpled bills and coins, placing them on the counter. The pharmacist sighed, counting it out. He shook his head. "This isn't enough, Marcus. I've let it slide too many times already." "Please," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "I just need a little more time." The pharmacist frowned, then looked away, tapping his fingers on the counter. After a moment, he nodded. "All right. But this is the last time. Understand?" Marcus nodded quickly. "Thank you, sir, thank you." He took the small bag with the medicine, his fingers numb around the plastic. He ran all the way home, the sky darkening above him. When he reached the apartment, he paused outside the door, catching his breath before pushing it open. Sarah was still on the couch, her eyes half closed. She opened them when Marcus entered, her face softening when she saw the bag in his hand. "You did it," she whispered. "Yeah," Marcus said, forcing a smile. "I did it, Mum." He handed her the pills and helped her sit up to take them. She squeezed his hand, her grip weak but full of love. Marcus sat beside her until she fell asleep again, her breathing steady, the lines of pain on her face easing. Marcus watched her for a long time, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The man in the Bentley, the way he looked at him, the $20 that made all the difference today. He didn't know why, but something told him that was not the last he'd see of that man. Marcus stood on the corner, his eyes darting from car to car. The city was alive with the usual noise, horns, people yelling, the hum of engines. He kept his rag ready, his hands already cold from the late afternoon chill. That day felt harder than usual. The drivers were more dismissive, more eager to wave him away before he even asked. He was used to it, but it still stung. The money he had collected so far wasn't enough, not even close. Then, from the distance, he spotted something different, a black Bentley moving towards the light. Marcus took a deep breath. A car like that usually meant trouble, either a window that wouldn't come down or a glare that said, "Stay away." But it also meant a chance. Maybe they'd pay just to get rid of him. The Bentley stopped right at the line. Marcus stepped forward, waving his rag slightly, not wanting to be too aggressive. The driver, a man in his 40s with a sharp look, gave Marcus a glance that screamed disinterest. Marcus hesitated for a moment, but then walked forward anyway. He didn't have the luxury of giving up opportunities. He began to wipe the windshield. The man inside frowned and lowered the window a crack. "No," the driver said firmly, his voice deep and authoritative. Marcus paused. He could feel his heart thudding against his ribs. "Please, sir, I need money for my mum's medicine," he said, the words leaving his mouth in a rush. The man stared at him, his face hard. For a second, Marcus thought he was going to shout at him to leave. Instead, the man sighed, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a wallet. He fished out a bill, folding it, and handed it through the small opening in the window. Marcus took it, fingers trembling as he saw it was a 20. "Thank you, sir," Marcus said, but the man didn't respond. He rolled up the window and waited for the light to change. Marcus stepped back, watching the Bentley as it drove away. He stood there, staring down at the $20 in his hand. It wasn't enough to clear the pharmacy debt, but it was something. Marcus tucked the money into his pocket and kept working. He needed more. The cold bit at his face as the sun began to dip. He worked on a few more cars, cleaning windows and hoping for more tips, but most drivers either waved him off or gave him just enough to buy a snack, not the medicine his mom needed. By the time it was almost dark, Marcus had gathered a little over $30. His stomach growled, but food wasn't on his mind. He walked to the pharmacy, his feet heavy, his thoughts racing. When he got there, he pushed open the door and approached the counter. The pharmacist, Mr. Green, looked up at him, his expression weary. "You got it, Marcus?" he asked. Marcus nodded, pulling the crumpled bills from his pocket and laying them on the counter. Mr. Green counted the money, then shook his head. "This still isn't enough, kid. I've helped you out too many times already. Please, Mr. Green." "My mum needs it," Marcus said, his voice cracking a little. Mr. Green sighed, then glanced at the back room. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "All right, but this is the last time, Marcus. I mean it. I can't keep covering for you." Marcus swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you, sir. Thank you." Mr. Green handed him a small paper bag with the medicine. Marcus clutched it, muttering another thank you before hurrying out of the store. The wind had picked up, and the air was even colder now. He ran all the way back home, clutching the bag tightly, his breath coming out in harsh puffs. When he finally reached their building, Marcus paused at the door, catching his breath. He pushed it open, his heart still pounding from both the run and the relief. He stepped inside, the warmth of the small apartment barely cutting through the chill that seemed to follow him everywhere. Sarah was still on the couch, her eyes half closed, a tired look on her face. She opened her eyes fully when she saw Marcus, and a weak smile crossed her lips. "You're back," she said. "Yeah, I got it, Mom," Marcus said, lifting the bag slightly. He walked over and knelt by the couch, helping her sit up. She took the pills he handed her, washing them down with a sip of water. Her hands were trembling slightly, her breathing still labored. "You're a good boy, Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded, swallowing the lump that formed in his throat. He watched as she lay back down, her eyes closing, her breathing gradually easing. He stayed by her side until he was sure she was asleep. After a while, Marcus got up and went to the small kitchen. He looked at the empty cabinets, his stomach growling again. He found a slice of bread, dry and old, but he ate it anyway. He had to save whatever money he could for tomorrow. There was no guarantee they'd be this lucky again. He went to his room, the walls cold and the air thick with the weight of everything that had happened that day. Marcus lay on his small bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the man in the Bentley. Something about the way he looked at Marcus stuck in his mind. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd see that man again. Marcus closed his eyes, the exhaustion from the day finally catching up to him. He drifted off, his dreams a chaotic mix of stoplights, cold winds, and his mother's tired smile. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing: he had to keep going for her. Marcus woke up the next morning, his body still aching from the cold day before. He rubbed his eyes, the weak morning light filtering through the curtain cracks. His mother was still asleep on the couch, her breath steady. He checked the clock, it was almost time for school. He moved quietly, getting ready, making sure not to make too much noise. As he grabbed his bag, a sound outside the window caught his attention. It wasn't the usual traffic noise or kids heading to school. It was something heavier, the unmistakable hum of an expensive car. Marcus peeked through the curtains and froze. Parked right outside their building was a sleek, black SUV. Marcus watched as the door opened and a man stepped out. His heart skipped a beat. It was the man from yesterday, the one with the Bentley. He stood still, unsure of what to do. The man walked towards their building, his suit crisp, his expression serious. Marcus heard a knock on the door. He approached it cautiously, then opened it just a crack. The man stood there, holding a calm expression. "Is this the Johnson residence?" he asked, his eyes landing on Marcus. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, his voice barely a whisper. "May I speak to your mother?" the man asked, his tone polite but firm. Marcus hesitated, glancing back at Sarah, who was now sitting up on the couch, confused. "Mom, there's someone here," Marcus called softly. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her, and Marcus opened the door wider to let the man in. He stepped inside, looking around at the small, worn apartment. The contrast with his own life was clear on his face. "Good morning, Mom. My name is Richard Harrison," he said, giving Sarah a nod. "I spoke to your son yesterday. He helped me out at the intersection." Sarah's face softened as she looked at Marcus. "Yes, Marcus mentioned you," she said, her voice weak. "How can we help you, Mr. Harrison?" Richard cleared his throat. "Actually, I came to see if I could help you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Marcus told me about your situation. I'd like to offer Marcus a job after school, if he's willing. Something that might make things a little easier for you both." Sarah blinked, surprise crossing her face. "A job? For Marcus?" "Yes," Richard nodded. "It's not charity, Mom. It's a job. I need someone to help organize my library. It's honest work, and I'll pay him fairly." Marcus looked at his mother, then back at Richard. A mix of emotions swirled inside him: hope, fear, uncertainty. "Mom?" he asked softly. Sarah sighed, looking at Marcus with tired eyes. "If it's what you want, Marcus." He nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I'll do it." "Good," Richard said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "I'll pick you up after school today. Be ready." With that, Richard gave a polite nod to Sarah and turned to leave. Marcus watched as the door closed behind him, the heavy sound echoing in the small space. He turned to his mother, a million questions in his eyes. Sarah gave him a small, weary smile. "Maybe this is what we needed, Marcus." That afternoon, Marcus waited by the school gates, his heart pounding. He still couldn't believe what had happened that morning. He scanned the street, looking for the familiar black SUV. It wasn't long before it appeared, pulling up right in front of him. The window rolled down, and Richard gestured for Marcus to get in. Marcus climbed in, the warmth of the car a sharp contrast to the cold outside. He glanced at Richard, who nodded at him. "Ready?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. They drove in silence, the cityscape slowly changing from crowded buildings to quieter, wealthier streets. Marcus had never been in this part of the city before. The houses were huge, with sprawling lawns and gates that looked taller than anything he'd ever seen. The SUV pulled up to a large house, almost like a mansion, and Marcus felt his breath catch. They walked inside, the warmth and opulence overwhelming Marcus. He tried not to stare, but everything seemed larger and brighter. Polished floors, high ceilings, paintings on the walls. Richard led him down a long hallway to a room filled with books, shelves that went from the floor to the ceiling. "This is the library," Richard said. "I need these books organized. Some are old, some are new. I want them categorized, listed. It's a lot of work, but I think you can handle it." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood everything. "I'll do my best, sir." Richard gave him a look. one that was hard to read. Good. I'll leave you to it. If you need anything, let one of the staff know. With that, Richard left, the door closing behind him. Marcus stood there for a moment, feeling out of place in the grand room. He took a deep breath and walked over to the nearest shelf, running his fingers along the spines of the books. He had never seen so many books in one place. He picked one up, carefully opening it. The pages were thick, the print old. He didn't understand why a man like Richard would want him to do this, but he didn't have the luxury to question it. He started working, pulling books from the shelves, trying to make sense of the disorganized piles. Hours passed, the quiet of the library broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway. Marcus tried to focus, but everything felt overwhelming. At one point, he bumped into a small table, and a framed photograph fell to the floor. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he knelt to pick it up, his hands trembling. The photograph was of a woman, beautiful, smiling, with kind eyes. Marcus looked at it for a moment before placing it back on the table. He hoped Richard wouldn't notice the small crack in the corner of the frame. By the time Richard returned, the sun had set, and Marcus felt exhausted. He had barely made a dent in the work, and his body ached from standing and moving books all day. "How did it go?" Richard asked, his eyes scanning the room. Marcus swallowed. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't get much done." Richard looked at the books, then at Marcus. He sighed, his expression softening. "It's all right, Marcus, it's your first day. You'll get the hang of it." Marcus nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, sir." Richard gave him a small nod. "Come on, I'll take you home." On the drive back, Marcus felt a mix of emotions, relief, exhaustion, a tiny bit of hope. He glanced at Richard, who seemed lost in thought, his eyes focused on the road. Marcus didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe things could change. Maybe there was a way out of the constant struggle. When they reached his building, Marcus climbed out of the SUV, turning to look at Richard. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice sincere. Richard nodded. "Be ready after school tomorrow, Marcus." Marcus watched as the SUV drove away, the tail lights disappearing into the night. He turned and walked inside, the small apartment feeling even smaller now after being in that mansion. He found his mother still on the couch, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "How was it?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Marcus gave her a tired smile. "It was good, Mom. I think it might help us." Sarah nodded, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I'm proud of you, Marcus." He nodded, sitting down beside her, the weight of the day finally catching up to him. He still didn't know why Richard had chosen to help him, but maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had a chance, a real chance to make things better. Marcus returned to the mansion the next day, determined to do everything right. He couldn't afford another mistake. Richard picked him up after school, and they rode in silence again. Marcus watched the city change as they moved through neighborhoods. He still couldn't believe he was going back to that huge house. It felt like he didn't belong, but he was going to make the best of it. They reached the mansion, and Marcus went straight to the library. He looked at the shelves, filled with books that seemed endless. He took a deep breath and started working, careful with every step he took. He didn't want to touch anything that might break this time. He worked for hours, his hands moving from shelf to shelf, organizing books by size, then by subject as best as he could understand. At some point, Marcus found an old, worn-out book on a high shelf, hidden behind a row of thicker volumes. It wasn't like the others. It was a diary. He opened it slowly, the pages yellowed and brittle. He began to read a few lines, his curiosity getting the best of him. The handwriting was neat, but rushed, as if the writer had been overwhelmed. Marcus realized it was Richard's diary, and one particular entry caught his eye. It talked about Richard losing his mother at a young age. Marcus felt a pang of empathy. He knew what it was like to be afraid of losing the person who meant everything to you. He knew the desperation that came with not being able to do anything about it. He read a few more lines, but then he heard footsteps in the hallway. Panic washed over him. Marcus quickly tried to shove the diary back into its place, but before he could, the door opened. Richard stood there, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the book in Marcus's hands. "What are you doing?" Richard asked, his voice low but tense. Marcus's heart sank. He swallowed hard, holding the diary out. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to read it." Richard stepped forward, taking the diary from Marcus's hands. His face hardened, and Marcus could see the anger behind his eyes. There was a long, painful silence. "This is personal," Richard said, his voice cold. "You don't touch things that don't belong to you, Marcus." Marcus nodded quickly, his face flushing with shame. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Harrison. I didn't mean to." Richard cut him off with a raised hand. "Just get back to work." Marcus nodded again, turning away, his hands trembling as he resumed organizing the books. He could feel Richard's eyes on him for a moment before the man turned and left the room, the door closing with a sharp click behind him. Marcus let out a shaky breath, the tension in the room almost unbearable. He knew he had messed up. He knew he had crossed a line he shouldn't have. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly, every sound in the mansion echoing louder in Marcus's ears. He kept his head down, doing his best not to draw any more attention to himself. When it was finally time for him to leave, Marcus gathered his things, his stomach twisted in knots. He hoped Richard wouldn't say anything more about the diary. He hoped he wouldn't lose this job. He needed it, for his mom, for everything. As he walked down the hall to the front door, he noticed the other staff members watching him. Their expressions were colder now, their eyes filled with distrust. He could feel the change. Word had spread quickly, and Marcus felt like he had a target on his back. When he got into the SUV, Richard didn't speak. The silence in the car was heavy, suffocating. Marcus kept his eyes on the window, watching the city lights blur as they passed. He wanted to apologize again, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He didn't think it would make a difference. Richard dropped him off at his building without a word. Marcus muttered a quiet thank you, but Richard just nodded, his face expressionless. Marcus watched as the SUV pulled away, a sinking feeling in his chest. He had ruined whatever chance he had to make things better. When Marcus entered the apartment, his mum was awake, sitting up on the couch, looking better than she had in days. She smiled at him, and Marcus forced a smile back. "How was work, honey?" she asked, her voice full of warmth. "It was fine," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't want to worry her. He walked over, giving her a hug, holding her tightly for a moment. "You're doing so well, Marcus. I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Marcus nodded against her shoulder. "Thanks, Mom." He sat with her for a while, helping her with her medication, making sure she was comfortable. But his mind was still back at the mansion, replaying the moment Richard found him with the diary. He couldn't shake the look on Richard's face, the disappointment, the anger. He knew he couldn't afford to make another mistake. The next day, Marcus returned to the mansion, dreading what was to come. He walked through the front door, and the staff barely acknowledged him. The warmth he had begun to feel was gone. He made his way to the library, determined to do his job, to prove that he could be trusted. Richard didn't come to see him that day. Marcus worked in silence, the weight of the previous day hanging over him. He couldn't help but feel that things had changed, that whatever small amount of trust he had built with Richard was gone. He knew he had to work harder to show that he wasn't just a kid who didn't know what he was doing. By the end of the day, Marcus had managed to organize most of the books, his hands aching from the effort. He hoped it would be enough, that Richard would see he was serious about this job. He needed Richard to see that he could be trusted, that he was more than just a kid from the street corner. As he left the mansion that day, Marcus felt the stares of the staff on his back. He kept his head down, focusing on the door, on getting out of there without causing any more trouble. He climbed into the SUV, and Richard drove him home, the silence between them as thick as ever. When they reached his building, Marcus hesitated before getting out. He looked at Richard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Harrison, I really am sorry. I won't make that mistake again." Richard looked at him for a long moment, his expression softening just slightly. He nodded. "Just do your job, Marcus. That's all I ask." Marcus nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I will." He got out of the car, closing the door behind him. As the SUV drove away, Marcus felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe he hadn't lost everything yet. Maybe he still had a chance to make this work. He took a deep breath and walked inside, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. The sound of wheezing filled the apartment. Marcus looked at his mother, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Her condition had worsened overnight. He could see it in the way her chest rose and fell, each breath taking more effort than the last. He tried not to panic, but the fear gnawed at him. "Mom, we need to get you to the hospital," Marcus said, his voice trembling. Sarah shook her head weakly. "We can't afford it." Marcus took her hand, his heart pounding. "It doesn't matter. We'll figure it out. Please." It took a lot of convincing, but eventually, Marcus managed to help his mother up. They left the apartment, Marcus's arm around her shoulders, supporting her as they walked slowly down the hallway. Each step felt like it took an eternity. By the time they reached the street, Marcus was sweating, both from effort and fear. He flagged down a cab, his mind racing with thoughts of how they'd pay for this. The hospital was busy, the waiting room filled with people, the air thick with tension. Marcus stayed by his mother's side, holding her hand as they waited to be seen. Hours passed, and finally, a nurse came to take Sarah back for an examination. Marcus was told to wait, and he watched as they wheeled his mother away, her frail form disappearing behind a pair of heavy doors. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The weight of everything hit him all at once. The medical bills, the job, the uncertainty of whether his mother would be okay. He felt helpless, and he hated it. He needed to be with her, to make sure she was all right. But there was nothing he could do now but wait. By the time they allowed Marcus to see her again, the sky outside had turned dark. Sarah was lying in a hospital bed, her eyes half open, a faint smile appearing when she saw Marcus. "Hey, baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus forced a smile. "Hey, Mom. How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said, closing her eyes again. "But I'm okay." Marcus nodded, though he could see how weak she was. The doctor came in a moment later, a serious expression on his face. Marcus stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Your mother needs treatment," the doctor said, his voice gentle but firm. "We need a deposit to proceed." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He knew they didn't have the money for it. He didn't even know where to start. "Please, just give me a little time," Marcus said, his voice cracking. The doctor nodded. "We'll do what we can for now, but we need that deposit soon." Marcus looked at his mother, her face peaceful in sleep. He couldn't let her down. He had to find a way. The next day, Marcus didn't go to work. He couldn't leave his mother alone at the hospital. He stayed by her side, holding her hand, watching her sleep. Every beep of the machines made his heart race. He knew he was supposed to be at the mansion, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He'd deal with the consequences later. The following morning, Marcus finally returned to the mansion. He walked through the front gate, his stomach twisted in knots. As he approached the library, he saw a cardboard box sitting just outside the door. His things were inside, his coat, his backpack, the few books he had been using to organize the library. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He had been fired. He picked up the box, his eyes burning. He turned and walked towards the front door, trying to get out of there before anyone saw him. Just as he reached the door, he heard a voice behind him. "Marcus!" He turned to see Richard standing there, his arms crossed, his expression hard. Marcus swallowed, his throat dry. "Why weren't you here yesterday?" Richard asked, his voice cold. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "My mum, she got worse. I had to take her to the hospital." Richard's eyes narrowed. "And you couldn't call?" "You couldn't let me know." Marcus shook his head, his voice trembling. I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison. I didn't have a way to contact you. I didn't know what to do." There was a long pause, the silence between them heavy. Richard looked at Marcus, his expression unreadable. "Do you understand what this job means, Marcus? It's not just about you, it's about responsibility." Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes. "I know, sir. I'm sorry, my mum is all I have." Richard's gaze softened slightly, and he uncrossed his arms. "Your mother is in the hospital?" Marcus nodded, wiping his eyes quickly. "Yes, sir, she needs treatment, but we don't have the money." Richard was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he let out a sigh. "My wife. She had a heart condition. She needed treatment too, and I couldn't save her." Marcus looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected Richard to say something like that. There was a vulnerability in his voice that Marcus hadn't heard before. Richard looked away, his jaw tight. "I know what it's like to feel helpless, to want to do everything and still not be able to fix it." Marcus swallowed, the words catching in his throat. I can't lose her. Not after everything." There was another long silence. Richard turned back to Marcus, his expression softening further. "Come with me." Marcus followed Richard down the hallway, his heart pounding. They entered the library, and Richard gestured for Marcus to sit. Richard took a deep breath and spoke. "I can help with the hospital bills, but this is not charity, Marcus. I need you to work for it, to prove that you're committed." Marcus nodded quickly. "I'll do whatever it takes, sir. I promise." Richard looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, I'll help your mother, but you need to be here every day, on time. No excuses." "Yes, sir. Thank you," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Richard stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "Go see your mother, and be back here tomorrow. We'll sort this out." Marcus nodded, standing as well. He left the mansion, the box of his things still in his hands, but his heart feeling lighter. He had a chance to make things right. When Marcus arrived at the hospital, he went straight to his mother's room. She was asleep, her breathing steady, her face peaceful. Marcus sat beside her, taking her hand gently in his. He felt the tension leave his body, the weight of everything easing slightly. "I got some help, Mom," he whispered. I think we're going to be okay." He stayed by her side until the nurse came to tell him visiting hours were over. Marcus left the hospital, the cold night air biting at his skin. But for the first time in days, he felt hope. He had made a promise to Richard, and he was going to keep it. He would work hard, do whatever it took to make sure his mom got better. The next day, Marcus returned to the mansion. Richard was waiting for him in the library, the room filled with books that still needed organizing. Marcus set his things down, ready to get to work. Richard looked at him, his face serious. "Remember what I said, Marcus. No more mistakes." Marcus nodded. "I understand, sir. I won't let you down." Richard gave a brief nod, then turned and left the room. Marcus took a deep breath, looking at the shelves, the task ahead of him daunting but necessary. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work, determination filling him. He wasn't just doing this for himself, he was doing it for his mother, for the chance at a better future. Marcus knew it was time. He couldn't delay it any longer. The pressure of everything, the bills, his mother's deteriorating health, the tension with Richard, had pushed him to a breaking point. He had to confront it all. He had to face Richard and tell him everything he had kept bottled up. The next morning, Marcus took a deep breath and walked into the mansion, his heart pounding. He moved quickly through the halls until he reached the library. He paused at the door, his hand trembling as he raised it to knock. He could hear faint footsteps inside, and when he pushed the door open, he found Richard standing there, staring at a framed photograph of his late wife. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He had never seen Richard like this, vulnerable, lost in thought, the picture clutched in his hand. Marcus cleared his throat softly, and Richard turned, his expression changing immediately as his eyes focused on Marcus. "Marcus," Richard said, his voice even. "What is it?" Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to step inside and close the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, gathering his courage. He couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. "Mr. Harrison," Marcus began, his voice shaking slightly. "I need to talk to you about everything." Richard raised an eyebrow, setting the picture down carefully. "Go on." Marcus looked down at the floor, then back up at Richard. His throat felt dry, and he struggled to find the right words. I don't know what else to do. My mum, she's all I have, and I'm scared I'm going to lose her. I've been trying, doing everything I can, but it's not enough. I need help. I can't do this alone." There was a silence that filled the room, heavy and almost suffocating. Richard stared at Marcus, his face unreadable. Marcus could feel his chest tightening, his heart pounding. He had just laid everything out there, exposed himself completely. He didn't know what Richard would say, but he couldn't take it back now. Richard let out a slow breath, his eyes softening. He walked over to one of the chairs and sat down, gesturing for Marcus to do the same. Marcus hesitated for a moment before sitting across from him, his hands clenched together. "You know, Marcus," Richard began, his voice softer now. "I see a lot of myself in you. I know what it's like to feel helpless, to have someone you love suffering and not know what to do about it. It's not easy." Marcus looked at Richard, the words sinking in. He could see something in Richard's eyes, a shared pain, a memory of his own struggles. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. Marcus swallowed, the tightness in his chest easing slightly. "I'm not asking for charity," Marcus said, his voice steadying. "I want to work for it. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll work harder. I'll take on more responsibilities. Just please, help me help her." Richard was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on Marcus. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right, Marcus. We'll make this work. I'll help with the medical expenses, but you have to keep your end of the deal. I expect you to work hard, to be responsible, and to keep up with your studies." Marcus nodded quickly, relief washing over him. "I will, sir. I promise." Richard leaned back in his chair, the tension in the room lifting slightly. "Good. We'll start from today. And Marcus, I want you to know that asking for help doesn't make you weak. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is let someone else in." Marcus looked at Richard, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He nodded, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. He had been carrying everything alone for so long, and now, for the first time, it felt like there was someone there to share the burden. That day, Marcus worked with renewed determination. He moved through the library, organizing books, dusting shelves, making sure everything was perfect. He knew Richard was watching, but instead of feeling pressure, Marcus felt motivated. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. When Marcus finished for the day, Richard came to check on his progress. He nodded approvingly as he looked around the library. "Good job today, Marcus," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Keep it up, and we'll get through this." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," Marcus replied, his voice full of sincerity. Richard paused for a moment, then spoke again, his voice softer. "I'm proud of you, Marcus. It takes courage to do what you're doing." Marcus felt his face flush slightly, a warmth spreading in his chest. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. Richard gave him a small smile, then turned and left the room, leaving Marcus standing there, a sense of accomplishment filling him. When Marcus returned home that evening, he felt lighter. His mother was awake, sitting up on the couch, her face brightening when she saw him. Marcus walked over, sitting beside her, a smile on his face. "How was work today?" Sarah asked, her voice full of warmth. "It was good, Mom," Marcus said, his heart swelling with hope. "Mr. Harrison is going to help us with the medical bills." Sarah's eyes widened, her face softening. "Oh, Marcus, that's wonderful. You're doing so much for me. I don't know how I could ever thank you." Marcus shook his head, taking her hand gently. "You don't need to thank me, Mom. I'm just doing what I have to do for you." Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes misty. "You're such a good boy, Marcus. I'm so proud of you." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt like they had a chance, a real chance to make things better. The next morning, Marcus returned to the mansion, ready to face the day. He walked into the library, his shoulders straight, his mind focused. He had a lot of work to do, but he was ready for it. Richard had given him a chance, and Marcus wasn't going to waste it. He moved through the library, working diligently, making sure every book was in its rightful place. The hours passed quickly, the work giving Marcus a sense of purpose. He was doing something that mattered, something that would make a difference. As the day drew to a close, Richard came to check on him. He looked around the library, nodding in approval. "You're doing well, Marcus," he said, his voice full of warmth. "I knew I could count on you." Marcus looked at Richard, his heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison." "I won't let you down." Richard gave him a smile, then turned to leave. Marcus watched him go, a sense of determination filling him. He had a long way to go, but he was ready for it. He had the support he needed, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like everything was going to be okay. Marcus adjusted to his new routine, the days blending together in a way that felt good, like progress. He would wake up early for school, knowing that the afternoons would be spent at the mansion, working in the library. It was a lot, but Marcus didn't mind. There was something satisfying about being busy, about knowing that his efforts were making a difference for his mom. When he arrived at the mansion each day, there was a sense of purpose that pushed him forward. The library had started to take on a more organized look, books shelved properly, sections marked, the dust that once covered the old volumes now gone. Marcus was proud of the work he'd done, and he could tell Richard noticed too. One afternoon, Marcus was working quietly in the library when Richard walked in. He looked around, nodding to himself before turning to Marcus. "You're doing a great job here," Richard said. "The library hasn't looked this good in years." "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied, smiling. It was a small compliment, but it meant the world to him. Richard paused for a moment, then spoke again, his voice softer. "How's your mom doing?" Marcus's smile widened a little more. "She's getting better. The doctors say the treatment is working. She's even able to get up and move around a bit." Richard nodded, a hint of a smile on his face. "I'm glad to hear that. You're doing good work, both here and at home." Marcus felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I just want to make sure she's okay." Richard looked at Marcus for a moment and then said, "You know, Marcus, I don't think I ever told you this, but I see a lot of potential in you. You're responsible, hard-working. You could do a lot if you keep at it. Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with determination. I will, sir, I promise. Over the next few weeks, Marcus's life settled into a rhythm. He would go to school in the morning, work at the mansion in the afternoon, and spend the evenings with his mom, helping her with her medication and making sure she was comfortable. Slowly, Sarah began to regain her strength. She could stand on her own now, even walk around the apartment a bit. One evening, as Marcus was helping her to the kitchen table for dinner, she looked at him, her eyes full of warmth. You've done so much for me, Marcus. I'm so proud of you. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling. I just want you to be okay, Mom. That's all that matters. Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I am, baby, thanks to you. Back at the mansion, things were changing too. Marcus had noticed that the other staff members were starting to treat him differently. They had been cold at first, distant after the incident with the diary, but now they seemed to see him as one of them. One afternoon, as Marcus was working, one of the housekeepers, Mrs. Jenkins, came into the library. You're doing a fine job here, Marcus, she said, her voice warm. If you ever need help with anything, just let me know. Marcus looked up, surprised. He smiled, nodding. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. I appreciate that. She nodded, giving him a kind smile before leaving the room. Marcus felt a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt before. He was no longer just a kid working at the mansion. He was part of the team. One afternoon, Richard walked into the library while Marcus was working. He watched Marcus for a moment before speaking. You're keeping up with your schoolwork, right? Marcus looked up, nodding. Yes, sir. I'm making sure to stay on top of everything. Richard nodded, a serious expression on his face. Good. Education is important, Marcus. It'll open doors for you. I want you to keep your grades up. Understand? Yes, sir. I will, Marcus replied, his voice full of determination. Richard's face softened, and he gave Marcus a small smile. I know you will. You've got a good head on your shoulders. Don't waste it. Marcus felt a surge of pride at Richard's words. He nodded, his heart set on proving himself, not just for Richard, but for his mom and for himself. As Marcus continued to work, he found himself growing closer to Richard. They didn't talk much about personal things, but there was a mutual respect that had formed between them. Richard no longer saw Marcus as just a kid from the streets, and Marcus no longer saw Richard as just a wealthy man who couldn't understand his struggles. They had found common ground, and it made all the difference. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, Marcus sat down with Richard in the library. Richard had just finished reading through some documents, and Marcus had finished organizing the last of the books. Mr. Harrison, Marcus began, his voice hesitant. I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for giving me this chance. Richard looked at Marcus, his expression softening. He nodded. You don't need to thank me, Marcus. You earned it, you worked hard, and you've proven yourself. Marcus felt a lump in his throat. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. Still, I'm grateful. Richard gave Marcus a small smile. And I'm proud of you, Marcus. You've come a long way. Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He had a purpose, a future, and he wasn't alone anymore. Marcus continued his work at the mansion, and as time passed, he felt more comfortable there. The library was finally in order, and now his tasks shifted to keeping it maintained and helping Richard with other small jobs around the house. It felt good to be trusted with more responsibilities, and Marcus took pride in every task he completed. One afternoon, Marcus was busy in the library when Mrs. Jenkins came in. a slight frown on her face. "Marcus," she called, her voice breaking his concentration. "Yes, Mrs. Jenkins." Marcus looked up, concerned by the tone in her voice. "We have a bit of an issue," she said. "Some of the deliveries that arrived this morning need to be brought inside, and I can't manage them alone. Could you lend me a hand?" Marcus hesitated. He had always worked on his own, taking pride in being independent, but he could see that Mrs. Jenkins genuinely needed help. He nodded, standing up from where he had been dusting. "Of course, Mrs. Jenkins, let's go." Together, they walked outside to where a delivery truck was parked. Several large boxes were stacked near the gate, each one heavy and unwieldy. Marcus picked up the first box, his arms straining under the weight. Mrs. Jenkins took another, though she clearly struggled to keep it steady. As they worked together, Marcus found himself glancing at Mrs. Jenkins. She was older, her face lined with age and experience, but her eyes were kind. She smiled at him as they carried the boxes inside, her face lighting up with gratitude. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, once they had set the last box down inside the kitchen. "I couldn't have done that without you." Marcus nodded, smiling. "No problem, Mrs. Jenkins. Happy to help." Mrs. Jenkins looked at Marcus for a moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "You know, it's okay to ask for help sometimes, Marcus. You don't have to do everything on your own." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He nodded, his eyes stinging slightly. "I know, Mrs. Jenkins. I'm learning." She smiled, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze before walking away. Marcus stood there for a moment, her words echoing in his mind. He had always tried to do everything by himself, to prove that he could handle it all. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry the weight alone. That evening, when Marcus returned home, he found his mother in the kitchen, her face lit with excitement. She was moving around more now, her strength slowly returning, and seeing her like this made Marcus's heart swell. "Hey, Mum!" Marcus called as he walked in, setting his bag down by the door. "Marcus, I made dinner tonight," Sarah said, her voice full of pride. She gestured to the small table, where plates of food were already set out. Marcus looked at her, his eyes wide. "Mum, that's amazing," he said, his voice full of warmth. Sarah smiled, her eyes misty. "I wanted to do something for you, Marcus. You've been taking care of me for so long, and I wanted to do something for you." Marcus felt his throat tighten, the emotions catching him off guard. He walked over and hugged his mother, holding her close. "Thank you, Mum," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This means a lot." They sat down together, the simple meal feeling like a feast. As they ate, Sarah looked at Marcus, her face softening. "You know, Marcus, you don't have to carry everything by yourself. You've done so much for me, and I want you to know that it's okay to lean on others sometimes." Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with emotion. "I know, Mom. I'm starting to understand that." Back at the mansion, Marcus found himself feeling more at ease around the staff. They no longer looked at him with suspicion, but with warmth and acceptance. One afternoon, as Marcus was working in the library, one of the other staff members, a young man named Tony, walked in. "Hey, Marcus," Tony called, leaning against the doorframe. "Need a hand with anything?" Marcus looked up, surprised by the offer. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Actually, yeah, I could use some help moving these books to the top shelf." Tony smiled, walking over to Marcus. Together, they lifted the heavy books, placing them carefully on the high shelf. As they worked, Tony glanced at Marcus. "You know, you're doing a great job here. Everyone's been talking about how much better the library looks." Marcus felt his face flush slightly, a warmth spreading through him. "Thanks, Tony. That means a lot." Tony nodded, giving Marcus a friendly pat on the back. "Keep it up, man. We're all rooting for you." Marcus watched as Tony left the library, a sense of pride filling him. He had always been so focused on doing everything alone, on proving himself. But now, he was starting to realize that he didn't have to do it all by himself. He had people around him who wanted to help, who cared. Later that week, Richard called Marcus into his office. Marcus walked in, his heart pounding slightly. Richard gestured for him to sit down, and Marcus did, his hands resting in his lap. "Marcus," Richard began, his voice steady. "And I've been watching you these past few weeks, and I have to say, I'm impressed. You've worked hard, you've taken on more responsibilities, and you've shown real growth." Marcus felt his chest swell with pride. He nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I'm trying my best." Richard leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Marcus's. "I want you to understand something, Marcus. Asking for help, relying on others, it doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger. It shows that you're willing to do whatever it takes to get through the challenges you face." Marcus swallowed, his throat tight. He nodded, his eyes meeting Richard's. "I understand, sir. I've learned that here, and I'm grateful." Richard gave him a small smile, nodding. "Good, because I want you to succeed, Marcus. And I know you can." That day, Marcus left the mansion with a sense of clarity. He had always been so focused on doing everything alone, on proving that he could handle it all without help. But now, he understood that real strength came from knowing when to accept help, from trusting those around him. When he arrived home that evening, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, her face brightening when she saw him. Marcus walked over, sitting beside her, a smile on his face. "How was work today?" Sarah asked, her voice full of warmth. "It was good, Mom," Marcus said, his heart swelling. "I'm learning a lot about myself, about everything." Sarah nodded, her eyes misty. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus. You've grown so much." Marcus smiled, his chest filled with warmth and pride. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah reached out, taking his hand. "And you're learning to trust others too, aren't you?" Marcus nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Yeah, I am." The next day, when Marcus arrived at the mansion, he was greeted by Mrs. Jenkins, Tony, and a few other staff members. They smiled at him, their faces full of warmth. "Welcome back, Marcus," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice full of warmth. "We've got a lot to do today, so let's get started." Marcus nodded, a smile on his face. "Let's do it." He spent the day working with the others, the sense of camaraderie filling him. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he was part of something bigger. He wasn't just a kid trying to survive, he was part of a team, part of a family. As the day drew to a close, Marcus stood in the library, looking around at the shelves he had organized, the books he had carefully placed. He felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense of belonging. He had come a long way, and he knew he still had a long way to go. But for now, he was right where he needed to be. Marcus's routine had become a comforting rhythm. He would wake up early, prepare his mother's breakfast, and head to school. His mornings were filled with classes, but instead of worrying constantly about his mom or the bills, he now focused on his studies. He had promised Richard that he would keep his grades up, and Marcus intended to keep that promise. He knew that education was his ticket to a better future, a way to give his mother a life without struggles. After school, Marcus would head straight to the mansion. The library had become like a second home to him. The once disorganized space was now neatly sorted, with every book catalogued and easy to find. The shelves that had once seemed overwhelming were now a testament to his hard work. Marcus felt a sense of pride every time he walked into the room, knowing that he had done this. Sarah's health had also shown significant improvement. The treatments had begun to work, and she was slowly regaining her strength. Marcus would often come home to find her standing in the kitchen, cooking dinner or tidying up. She still tired easily, but seeing her up and about was a huge relief for Marcus. It felt like they were finally on the right path. One evening, Marcus returned home to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table, a smile on her face. She looked stronger, her cheeks no longer as pale, her eyes filled with warmth. "Marcus," she called as he walked in, "come here for a second." Marcus set his bag down and walked over to her, his curiosity piqued. "What is it, Mom?" he asked. Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of you," she said, her voice soft. "You've grown so much, and you've done so much for me. I can never thank you enough." Marcus felt his throat tighten, the words catching in his chest. He squeezed her hand gently. "You don't need to thank me, Mom. I'm just doing what I need to do for you." Sarah smiled, her eyes misty. "You're a good boy, Marcus, and I know you're going to do great things." Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with determination. He had come a long way, and he knew that the future was still uncertain, but he was ready to face whatever challenges came his way. Back at the mansion, Marcus continued his work, taking on more responsibilities as Richard entrusted him with additional tasks. One day, Richard called Marcus into his office, his face serious but kind. "Marcus," Richard began, gesturing for him to sit down, "I want you to understand how far you've come. When I first met you, you were just a kid cleaning windshields at a stoplight. Now, you're here, working hard, taking care of your mother, and keeping up with your studies. That's no small feat." Marcus looked at Richard, his eyes wide, his chest swelling with pride. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without you." Richard smiled, nodding. "You've earned everything you have, Marcus. And I want you to know that I believe in you. I see a lot of potential in you, and I think you're going to do great things if you keep at it." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I won't let you down, sir, I promise." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "I know you won't. Just remember, Marcus, you don't have to do everything alone. You have people around you now, people who care about you and want to help." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. He knew that Richard was right. He had spent so much of his life trying to do everything on his own, but now he had people he could rely on, people like Richard, Mrs. Jenkins, Tony, and even his mother. He wasn't alone anymore. One afternoon, as Marcus was working in the library, Tony came in, a big smile on his face. "Hey, Marcus," he called, leaning against the doorframe. Marcus looked up, smiling back. "Hey, Tony." "What's up?" "Mrs. Jenkins and I were talking, and we thought you could use a little break," Tony said. "How about we go grab a snack?" Marcus hesitated for a moment. He had always been so focused on his work, on making sure everything was perfect. But as he looked at Tony's smiling face, he realized that maybe it was okay to take a break every once in a while. "Sure," Marcus said, setting down the book he'd been holding. "Let's go." They walked down to the kitchen, where Mrs. Jenkins had already set out some snacks. Marcus sat down with Tony and Mrs. Jenkins, the three of them laughing and talking about their day. Marcus felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in a long time. He was part of something now, part of a family. Over the next few weeks, Marcus continued to balance school, work, and caring for his mum. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when he felt overwhelmed, when the weight of everything threatened to pull him down. But on those days, Marcus remembered Richard's words. He didn't have to do it all alone. One evening, after a particularly long day, Marcus sat down with his mother at the kitchen table. She looked at him, her eyes full of pride and warmth. "You're doing so well, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice soft. "You've grown so much, and I know that whatever you set your mind to, you're going to achieve it." Marcus smiled, his chest swelling with emotion. "Thanks, Mom. I'm just trying to make things better for us." Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "And you have, Marcus. You've made our lives so much better. I'm so proud of you." Marcus nodded, his eyes stinging slightly. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He had a future where he could take care of his mum, where he could achieve his dreams. The day came when Marcus received his school report card. He had worked hard, and it showed. He looked at the grades, his heart swelling with pride. He had done it. He had kept his promise to Richard, to his mom, and to himself. He couldn't wait to show his mom the report card, to see the pride in her eyes. When he got home, he found his mother in the living room, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Hey, Mom," Marcus called, holding up the report card. "Look at this." Sarah took the report card, her eyes scanning the grades. She looked up at Marcus, her face breaking into a smile. "Oh, Marcus, I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice full of emotion. Marcus felt his throat tighten, his heart swelling with pride. He hugged his mother, holding her close. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah pulled back, looking at Marcus, her eyes filled with warmth. "You're going to do great things, Marcus. I know it." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for it. He had come a long way, and he had no intention of stopping now. As Marcus stood in the library that afternoon, looking around at the shelves he had organized, he felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense of pride. He had faced challenges, he had stumbled, but he had gotten back up every time, and now he was stronger for it. Richard walked into the library, looking at Marcus with a smile. "Marcus," he said, his voice full of warmth, "you've done an amazing job here. I knew you could do it." Marcus looked at Richard, his chest swelling with pride. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I couldn't have done it without your help." Richard nodded, his eyes softening. "You've earned everything, Marcus, and I know you're going to go far. Just remember, you're not alone. You have people who care about you." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. He knew that now. He wasn't alone, and he never would be again. As Marcus looked around the library, at the mansion that had become like a second home to him, he felt ready to face whatever the future held. He was stronger now, more determined, and he knew that no matter what challenges came his way, he would overcome them. He was ready to change his story, and he knew that with the people around him, with the support of those who cared, he could achieve anything. And with that thought, Marcus smiled, ready to embrace the future, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever.